Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in Critical Times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, Critical Discussions in these Critical Times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly, and this is our special Week in Review program as we look back at some of the big stories of the last 7 days and a lot going on nationally, internationally, too. Here at home, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is still beating the drum for Alberta independence, notwithstanding the fact that on the other side of her mouth, she's saying that, yeah, she kind of likes what Carney's doing with the infrastructure bill and things of this nature. But I just, as you watch these headlines, I would caution you and remind you that there's going to be an election in Alberta in the next few months, and that she's appealing to her base, her hardcore right-wing base with a lot of this stuff. I don't know how sincere she is, but that's Danielle Smith, and we'll take that for what it's worth. Let me focus, though, a little bit more on some of the international stuff, because that was the story and the headline once again. A couple of weeks ago, it was the G7 meeting, which was held in Alberta. This week, it was NATO. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was there, and very favorable reviews on his performance and Canada's performance at this. But I want to talk a little bit more about how the impact it's going to have, because there are some very important decisions made at that meeting. Number one, of course, is that NATO has decided to back this defense hike. Canada made the announcement a few weeks ago, you may recall, that we were finally going to attain that NATO goal of 2% of GDP for military and defense spending. Well, that lasted, about 10 days, and then NATO decided at this past meeting that no, not 2%, 5%. And Canada's on side with this. Prime Minister Carney talked about this and said that, look, this is something that just has to happen because of the world situation, what's going on in so many different places right now, and what's going on with our own sovereignty. Some of the challenges from south of the border from Mr. Trump, but also to our north with a number of countries, including Canada, the United States, China, Russia, and so many others that are eyeing the Arctic and the Northwest Passage trade routes and say, we want a piece of that. And so we've got to be on guard for thee and for us and for that too. So this is an important deal. It's a necessary deal. It's going to have significant impacts, of course, on the Canadian economy to be able to get to that 5%. It's going to be a tough ride. This is like rolling a rock uphill to try to get there. And Carney talked about that and some of the challenges. And we'll talk more about that in detail in future weeks, of course, as some of those policies roll out. But Canada's in the game. And I think that's something that a lot of the other NATO members were watching for. And I think very pleased with Canada's role in that particular process. Some other things that came out of this as well. By the way, can I, just as a quick aside, there was a lot of glad handing, as usually is at these meetings. The NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, was effusive, shall we say, in his praise for Donald Trump, saying he alone was the guy that got this whole thing going. And if it weren't for Trump, NATO wouldn't be on side with this, and we wouldn't have European nations and Canada, for that matter, doing their fair share. So thank you, Mr. Trump. I mean, the praise was over the top. And I've heard other descriptors of it as well, but I'm hoping that Mr. Rutte will temper his enthusiasm just a little bit. The United States is the big dog in NATO. There's no two ways about that. But there's some other people there that are important players in the global policies that NATO would espouse to. And it's going to be interesting to see just how Trump decides to play this. Don't forget, this is the guy that in his first term wanted to pull the U.S. out of NATO altogether. So is he an advocate for it now? Well, time will tell. One of the other key discussions, by the way, and especially when we looked at the communique that came out at the end of the meeting, was, of course, the NATO policy of an attack on one is attack on all. Trump has never really been in favor of that, and his enthusiasm for it and his support for that particular phrase at this particular NATO meeting was, well, tepid at best. Whatever seemed to be the attitude. The test will be, of course, if in fact a NATO nation is attacked, whether it's by Russia or whomever, will the Americans stand up, and as the rest of the NATO members did. Don't forget, the only time that Article 5 has actually been enacted was after 9/11. When all NATO nations, Canada included, went to the defense of the United States. Nobody has enacted it since, and the United States has been the only beneficiary. So is Trump going to keep that in mind? Well, I don't want to put money on that, but we'll see how that rolls out. So anyway, the other element to this course is going to be the impact that it's going to have on the Canadian economy. But tied to that as well is the passage of the bill, the infrastructure bill, as some people are calling it here in Canada. It did pass through the Commons. It was passed by the Senate. It received royal assent, so it is now law. And that's as Carney says, going to be a key part of even the 5% GDP for defense spending that's going to go in, because part of that 5%, 1.5% of that is going for infrastructure projects, highways, airports, things of this nature, which could be economic drivers, as Carney talked about, plus some of the other elements that he's talked about in that infrastructure bill and the Get Canada Moving bill are going to be revenue generators. They're also going to attract outside investment, which he thinks is going to temper some of the impact it might have on taxpayers. So, the doom and gloom that some people are suggesting that this 5% commitment is actually going to send us deep, deep into debt, not necessarily so. There is a plan, the Prime Minister tells us, and he's given us a little bit of that from time to time, and it's going to be interesting to see just how that rolls out over the next little while. There are factors, though, that come into play for Canada's economy, for the NATO commitment and everything else. And that, of course, is what's happening around the world. The Middle East is still very, very unstable. The Iranian-Israeli war that we say, or is being told now, is over. There's a ceasefire as of the recording of this particular podcast. It's very tenuous, though. There's still some reports of some skirmishes, shall we say, missile skirmishes going back and forth. Trump, again, wants to take all the credit for that, especially with the bombardment, of course, of the Iranian nuclear facilities that we talked about, and that's still not even decided as to just how effective that was. Trump used some rather strong words and strong descriptors about annihilating the whole process and set them back hundreds of years. It seems as if it wasn't quite as effective as Trump and some of his minions at the White House suggested. Certainly did some damage, and Iran, I think, is admitting that. But as to how extensive that is and whether they're going to be back on their heels, I'm not so sure. And we'll see in the passage of the next couple of weeks just how they respond to that and how the United States is going to respond to that. But it certainly did put a fly in the ointment of trying to find lasting peace. And by the way, it also seemed to take our minds off of what was going on in Gaza, which is still a crisis and a humanitarian crisis as well as a military crisis. And that is yet to be resolved. So Canada's role in that, well, it's to be seen just how important we want to get involved in that. Prime Minister Carney says he wants Canada to be a player in these discussions and some of these decisions. And, you do that by strength of power. I mean, Canada used to be that peacemaker, that arbiter in these situations. We kind of fell off that wagon and have not done much of that in the last little while. I'm getting the sense that the Prime Minister wants to kind of get back into that and let Canada be a player on that international scheme. One other story that I wanted to touch on here, because I think it's very important, and it's, again, something that kind of fell off the radar because of all the other things that went on with the G7 meeting, with the NATO meeting, are the negotiations between Canada and the United States for a trade deal. This started, of course, some weeks ago when Prime Minister Carney visited Trump in Washington, and they seemed to get along okay. And there was some discussion there about trying to renegotiate trade deals. And the two leaders set an arbitrary date, really, of mid-July, really, to say, look, we've got to get a deal. And Prime Minister Carney, I think, reinforced Canada's commitment to that just a couple of days ago by suggesting that if there's no deal by then their counter tariffs come into play, which he says are going to be significant and he thinks effective against the United States in so many different ways. I guess details of that will roll out later on. But what happened this week, I think, is noteworthy. Kirsten Hillman, who is the Canadian ambassador to Washington, is the lead negotiator for Canada with these trade negotiations. And she did a series of interviews, and the tone of those interviews seemed to be, look, guys, manage your expectations here. And I think we're hearing that from the Prime Minister and from some of the other members of Cabinet, Dominic LeBlanc and others who are involved in this process, that I think what we have to gird ourselves for here in Canada is that Trump's not going to give up tariffs. They're not going away. I mean, that's the ultimate goal for the Canadian team. But Trump has said tariffs are here to stay. He has reiterated that at the NATO meeting. He sure did at the G7 meeting in Alberta a couple of weeks ago, too. So, can we live with tariffs? On top of that, of course, there's a concern right now that the template that may be used for any sort of deal between Canada and the United States may be the one that the UK signed with the Americans a little while ago. That included some tariffs, but it also included quotas, which could have an impact on the steel industry and a number of different industries that are already being impacted by some of these unfortunate tariffs, some of these, well, not illegal, I guess, is on the eyes of the beholder, but they're punitive and unnecessary, but it's something that Trump is just hanging his hat on right now. So what happens if, in fact, the United States digs their heels in and says, they're here, tariffs are here, they're not going away? Does Canada walk away and say, okay, fine, you want to play ball that way? That's the way we'll play. Is there going to be an acrimonious split here? Is there going to be some middle ground? And how's that going to impact industry? a lot of industries, the steel industry, and the aluminum industry and the auto industry in particular, all looking to see what this is going to look like when it's all done, if in fact they can find some sort of a solution sometime in this month. So that's a story that we're going to be following and talking about on the podcast. It's been a busy, busy week. And as always, we've enjoyed talking to you about it, and certainly enjoyed getting your feedback about what's going on and some ideas about where Canada should be leaning and exactly what the next step should be. And we'll continue to do that on future podcasts. That's it for this edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast Week in Review. As always, you can catch us anywhere on wherever you get your podcasts on any platform. We always include, and we will do it on this podcast as well, some background stories to kind of give you a little meat on the bones about some of these stories. So to help with the discussions and the dialogues that we always like to encourage on this. Thanks as always to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.